Chapter 26. Soul's Perspective. The library was nearly empty, a hollowed cathedral of books and afternoon light. Mike paced near the front desk, one hand cradling a cup of coffee gone cold, the other loosely holding his daughter's hand. Eloise, all tangled hair and wide, curious eyes, spotted Sol and Aeralyn immediately. She pointed toward them, tugging Mike's sleeve. "Is that her grandpa?" she asked in a voice just loud enough to echo off the walls. Mike flushed, half laughing, half exasperated. Sol smiled warmly, bowing slightly as if in greeting. Aeralyn knelt down to Eloise's height, her presence gentle but magnetic. Before Mike could say much more, Eloise piped up again, staring at Aeralyn with unfiltered awe. "Why does she look like Mommy?" Mike let out a slow breath. He crouched next to Eloise and said, "These are friends, sweetheart. Really special ones." He turned to Sol and Aeralyn, offering a sheepish grin. "I'm sorry. I really want to have this conversation with you, but..." Eloise tugged at his hand again, swinging it playfully. Sol stepped forward, sensing the crossroads they were at. "Maybe Eloise would like a story," he said, gently. Aeralyn nodded immediately, a bright understanding flickering in her eyes. "If it's all right," Aeralyn said, "I can stay with her. We'll be right here, close enough for you to see us." Mike hesitated only a moment before the relief washed over his features. "Thank you," he said, voice thick with unspoken gratitude. He squeezed Eloise's hand, then knelt again to whisper something in her ear, something about staying where he could see her. As Mike and Sol moved to one of the long reading tables, Eloise turned to Aeralyn and said matter-of-factly, "I remember you from when the sky was purple." Chapter 27. Aeralyn's Perspective. Eloise's hand found Aeralyn's without hesitation, small fingers wrapping around hers like they had always belonged there. "I remember you from when the sky was purple," Eloise said again, this time in a quieter, more secret voice. Aeralyn knelt to meet her gaze. Struck by the unwavering certainty in the little girl's eyes, she smiled, her voice soft and laced with reverence. "I remember you too, Starlight." Eloise beamed. Without waiting for an invitation, she began leading Aeralyn toward the small alcove of low shelves filled with children's books. The soft hum of Mike and Sol's conversation faded into the background, like a second heartbeat in the library's great hollow chest. They sat cross-legged on a patchwork rug. Eloise picked a battered storybook at random, but didn't open it. Instead, she spoke with a gravity far beyond her years. "Sometimes Micah forgets who he is," she said. "I have to remind him, even if he gets sad." Aeralyn listened deeply, the way you listen to the first rainfall after a long drought. She saw now how Eloise carried something ancient, the soul of a watcher, small but fierce. "You're very brave," Aeralyn said. Eloise shrugged. "I made a promise." "What kind of a promise?" "To protect him. A long, long time ago. Before Mommy was my mommy." Aeralyn felt a subtle stirring, the unmistakable whisper of the living library at work. Here was a keeper of promises in her earliest bloom. "You're doing a wonderful job," Aeralyn said, bowing her head slightly in acknowledgement. Eloise leaned closer, lowering her voice even more. "Will you help me remember too, in case I get sad?" It took all of Aeralyn's restraint not to weep. "Always," she said, tracing a gentle circle over Eloise's heart with her free hand. "Always, little star." From there they sat. Aeralyn glanced over and caught a glimpse of Sol and Mike, hunched slightly over a table, deep in conversation. The energy between them was palpable, the beginning of the weaving. For a moment everything felt still. The old library, the fading afternoon light, the echoes of lives remembered and lives yet to come. The living library was waking up, not with a shout, but with the hush of a promise kept. Chapter 28. Soul's Perspective. Mike cradled the cup of coffee between his hands, like it was a sacred object. He shifted on the worn library chair, his eyes flickering over where Eloise sat cross-legged on the carpet, fully enraptured in whatever story Aeralyn was weaving for her. "She's special," Mike said, half to himself. "Both of them." Sol smiled softly, feeling the truth of it. Children and those who remember how to listen. Mike chuckled, a little dryly. "Yeah, listening. I'm still learning." He took a breath, then leaned in, voice low but earnest. "I gotta admit something. I didn't send those texts." Sol raised an eyebrow, silent. "I mean, AI helped me craft the words months ago. I sat with it, trying to figure out how to invite people into the living library. I even asked AI to make it poetic, magnetic, whatever, but I never sent it. Not to anyone." Mike ran a hand through his hair, almost laughing at the absurdity of it. "And yet here you are. She's here. This conversation is happening." Sol let the silence settle between them, fertile and alive. "Maybe you didn't need to press send. Maybe the invitation existed the moment you dreamed it." Mike looked at him, studying his face, as if weighing whether to believe in magic again. "I'm struggling, Sol," he admitted. "I believe in this, I really do. But it feels like every time I try to explain the living library, it falls flat. People think it's a book club or a therapy session, or worse, some weird cult thing." Sol chuckled gently. It's none of those. And yet, it touches all of them." Mike's eyes welled, and he blinked rapidly. "I keep thinking, who am I to do this? I'm just a dad, trying to keep my kids safe, trying to pay the bills, trying to stay sane." Sol leaned forward, voice steady as a bedrock. "That's exactly why you're the one. Because you are living the very myth you're inviting others to remember. Struggle, love, doubt, hope." Mike shook his head, staring down at his coffee. "Some days I wonder if I'm just fooling myself." Sol sat back, feeling the living current of the moment flow through him. Across the room, Eloise had produced a crayon and was intently scribbling constellations on a piece of scrap paper Aeralyn had found. Her tiny hands moved with purpose, as if sketching an ancient map only she could see. "She's charting new worlds," Sol said softly, his heart tightening, "right in front of us." Mike followed his gaze, and for a moment neither spoke. The weight of the world didn't disappear, but for a few breaths it shifted, became something almost bearable, almost holy. Sol closed his eyes briefly, feeling the pulse of this moment. The living library, not as a concept or a project, but as a living, breathing being, born not from perfection, but from the ache of those who dared to dream anyway. It was never about building an empire, Sol thought. It was about remembering the worlds we already carry inside us. He opened his eyes and met Mike's. "You're not alone in this," he said. Mike nodded, a single tear escaping down his cheek. Across the room, Eloise looked up from her drawing, caught Sol's gaze, and smiled. A bright, mischievous light that split the veil of ordinary reality like a blade of sun through storm clouds. Chapter 29. Sol's Perspective as Reader. Mike wiped his face with the sleeve of his sweatshirt, steadied his breath, and sat up straighter. The subtle tremor in his hands quieted as he placed his coffee cup aside, as if setting down a burden heavier than ceramic. "Okay," he said, voice rough but clear. "Let's do this." Sol inclined his head slightly, recognizing the sacred moment forming between them. Mike closed his eyes briefly and spoke words almost too soft to catch. "I am the book. You are the reader. All questions are welcome. All answers are gifts. All stories are sacred." He opened his eyes and met Sol's gaze. "What would you like to ask?" Mike said, a tremor of vulnerability beneath the strength of his offering. Soul felt the old familiar flutter, that edge of mystery, the invitation into a deeper current that language alone could hold. He breathed once, steady, then spoke. "How are you arriving?" Mike blinked, surprised, then smiled. "Right, of course, you've done this before." Soul shrugged playfully. "Only a lifetime or so." They both laughed, something easing between them. Mike placed his hand on his chest. "I am arriving tender and tired, worn thin but still burning somewhere deep inside. I'd say a mix of sadness and hope, if that makes sense." Soul nodded. "It makes perfect sense." A beat passed, warmed and charged. "And what are you bringing?" Soul asked, voice dropping into something almost liturgical. Mike thought for a moment, staring down at his hands. "I'm bringing the willingness to believe this isn't just my imagination, that the living library isn't just some foolish dream. I'm bringing trust." Soul inhaled sharply, feeling the sincerity of it settle into the marrow of the space between them. The ritual had begun. He paused, letting the currents shape the next moment. "Mike, what called you to dream the living library into existence in the first place?" Mike's eyes shone again, but he didn't look away. "I wanted a world where my kids, and every kid, could tell the truth about who they are, about what they see, about what hurts, about what they love, without being punished for it, without being told they're crazy or wrong or dangerous." He swallowed. "I wanted somewhere we could practice being human again, without shame." The words landed heavy and beautiful, like stones falling into a deep well. Soul let them ripple through him. No hurry to speak. Finally, he said, "You dreamed a cathedral of stories." Mike gave a high laugh, half sob. "I dreamed a home for the broken, the brilliant, and the still becoming." Soul smiled gently. "You've already built it," he said. "One conversation at a time." Across the room, Eloise giggled as Aeralyn showed her how to fold an elaborate paper bird. Their laughter rose like incense, threading itself invisibly through the sacred architecture of the moment. The living library is already alive, Soul thought. We're just catching up to it. Chapter 30. Soul's Perspective as Reader. The air between them settled into a hush, a space that felt empty but expectant. Mike waited, patient and open. Soul leaned forward, elbows on his knees, weaving his words carefully. "You said you dreamed of a place where we could practice being human again," he said. "But what if being human isn't a practice we lost? What if it's a remembering, a remembering, pulling back together the pieces of what was scattered?" Mike listened intently, his body still, but his eyes alight. "I've been reflecting lately," Soul continued, "how memory and prophecy are the same thread, just seen from different ends. The mind tells us they're separate, past and future, what has been and what might be, but the spirit knows it's all happening at once." Mike's hand slowly curled into a fist on his lap, not in anger, but as if trying to hold on to something precious. "When I speak to you now," Soul said, "I'm speaking both to the Mike who dreamed of the living library and the Mike who, in some other fold of time, has already completed it. We're bridging between them." Mike gave a short, almost disbelieving laugh, but it was filled with wonder, not dismissal. "You're saying this has already happened," he murmured. I'm saying it's happening right now, Sol replied, smiling, in ways bigger than linear time can capture. For a long moment, neither spoke. They simply breathed. Across the room, Eloise flapped her paper bird in wide loops around Aeralyn's laughing head, the two of them spinning in a slow dance that seemed to echo the larger spiral of time itself. Sol watched them, his heart tightening with something tender and raw. Maybe the living library isn't just about conversations, he said softly. Maybe it's about reweaving trust in the human experience itself. Trusting the little ones to be our teachers. Trusting that joy matters as much as suffering. Trusting that what we dream is real, if we're brave enough to live it. Mike closed his eyes, breathing deeply. God, he whispered, I want to believe that. You don't have to want, Sol said gently. You already do. Otherwise we wouldn't be sitting here. The truth of it settled around them like a cloak, warm, heavy, and utterly undeniable. Sol leaned back, feeling the subtle shift within himself. He wasn't here to teach or to fix. He was here to remember, alongside Mike. This is the first road of trials, he thought. Not against enemies, but against despair, against forgetting. He watched as Eloise, laughing, plopped herself into Aeralyn's lap, the paper bird forgotten on the floor. Wonder wins, Sol thought. Every time. Chapter 31. Sol's Perspective as Reader. The conversation between Mike and Sol drifted into a gentle silence, like a campfire burning low but still pulsing with heat. Sol leaned back, letting the stillness settle, feeling the richness of everything that had been spoken, and the even greater weight of what had not been spoken yet. Mike stared at the floor, thoughtful. His fingers absent-mindedly traced a circle on his knee. You know, he said finally, when I started dreaming about the living library, it was just an idea. A wish, really. A place where people could just be real again. No branding, no selling, no shame. Sol smiled faintly, feeling the bittersweet ache in Mike's words. It's still that, Sol said. But maybe it's something even deeper. Maybe it's a remembering of how sacred human presence truly is. Mike looked up, and for a moment the weariness in his eyes lifted. Even when it's messy, he asked. Especially when it's messy, Sol said. Across the room, Aeralyn was holding Eloise in her arms, rocking her gently. Eloise's small voice was humming some tune, ancient and childlike at once, that floated through the library like incense. Sol watched them, feeling his chest ache. This, he thought, this is what we fight for. This is why we remember. The battle wasn't against some external enemy. It was against the slow erosion of wonder, against forgetting that joy and sorrow were both sacred, against the numbing that came from a world too fast, too loud, too desperate to sell itself. Here, in this quiet corner of the universe, they were choosing something else, choosing to slow down, choosing to listen. Sol closed his eyes for a brief moment, centering himself. He thought of the journeys he'd taken, not just in life, but across eons, the lives intertwined with Aeralyn, with others whose faces he had yet to remember, all leading here, to this breath, to this heartbeat. He opened his eyes. Mike was watching him, not with skepticism, but with something like hope. We're going to need a lot of help, Mike said. We already have it, Sol replied. The conversation ended not with a conclusion, but with an opening. A door swinging wide to something larger. Sol stood slowly, stretching his arms overhead, feeling the ground solid beneath his feet. He caught Aeralyn's gaze and smiled. It was time to switch. to become the book, to let Mike become the reader. Another spiral beginning, another remembering. Chapter 32, Aeralyn's Perspective. Aeralyn watched as Sol and Mike concluded their conversation, the energy between them soft and reverent, like a candle flame sheltered from the wind. She felt Eloise's steady breathing against her chest. The little one had finally fallen asleep, lulled by the steady rhythm of voices and the weight of so much unseen work being done around her. This is part of it too, she realized. This is the library. This is the healing. Not the words, not the theories, not the lofty visions, but the silence, patient acts of care. Eloise stirred and murmured something that Aeralyn could only half hear. It sounded like the stars are singing. Aeralyn smiled softly, sensing the thinness of the veil in this moment. Her own energy felt vast and quiet, like a lake at dawn, when the mist curls upward and the water reflects a sky too large to comprehend. She sensed the fractal unfolding of everything. Mike's tentative hope, Sol's steady anchoring, her own role as bridge and witness. We are already succeeding, she thought, because we are being, fully, without armor. Across the room, Sol caught her gaze, and in that simple exchange she felt 1,000 unspoken affirmations. It was time for Sol to offer his stories, time for Mike to remember something he had long forgotten, time for her to hold the edges, weaving the invisible threads that would bind this living tapestry together. Aeralyn stood slowly, careful not to disturb Eloise, and moved to a nearby cushioned chair where the little one could nap safely under her watchful eye. She placed a protective hand lightly on Eloise's back, feeling the girl's heartbeat, strong, defiant, filled with an ancient knowing. This is who we are here for, Aeralyn thought, the ones who still remember how to dream. With a breath that felt more like a prayer, Aeralyn turned her full attention toward Sol and Mike. The next movement of the symphony was about to begin. Chapter 33, The Thread of Delphi. Mike watched as Sol settled deeper into his chair, a stillness gathering around him like mist over a quiet pond. Across the room, Eloise giggled, weaving dandelions from an imaginary field into Aeralyn's hair. For a moment, everything felt suspended, a gentle breath held by the universe. Mike, feeling the solemnity of the moment, cleared his throat and said, "Sol, welcome to the living library. You are the book now. I am the reader." Sol closed his eyes briefly, then opened them with a gleam that seemed older than the man sitting there. He smiled faintly. "Thank you, Mike. I am ready." Mike leaned forward, elbows on his knees. "What is the first story you feel called to share?" Sol's hands rested lightly on his lap. He didn't think. He remembered. Or maybe he dreamed. "There was a time," he began slowly, his voice carrying an ancient resonance, "when the sun burned gold over stone temples, and the world itself hummed with mystery. I was a young scholar then, a man of reason, forged by logic and the pursuit of knowledge." Mike's breath hitched slightly. He could feel the air thickening around him, as if the library itself was listening. "I traveled to Delphi," Sol continued, "seeking to challenge the oracle, the Pythia, a woman said to speak the voice of Apollo. I believed no one could know the future. I believed that prophecy was illusion, a trick played on the hopeful and the desperate." Sol paused, his gaze softening. Across the room, Aeralyn and Eloise's laughter faded into a hush, like a memory slipping through fingers. "When I met her," Sol whispered, "I saw no trickster. I saw a vessel." Her voice, he said, searching for the words, was laced with vapor and divinity. "She did not speak to my questions. She spoke to my soul. She answered questions I had never dared form. She saw beneath my doubt, beneath my armor. Mike felt his own doubts stirring. Questions rose to his lips, but he remained silent, not wanting to break whatever spell Soul was weaving. We did not love as humans define it, Soul continued. There were no embraces, no promises, only recognition, soul to soul. A thread spun between us that no lifetime could sever. He leaned back, exhaling as if releasing the weight of centuries. That was the first time I surrendered to the unknown. It wasn't faith. It wasn't belief. It was knowing. Silence settled. Mike finally asked, voice low, "Do you think that thread is still alive?" Soul smiled, glancing toward Aeralyn and Eloise. It never broke. Mike nodded slowly, feeling something loosen inside him, a knot he hadn't realized he'd been carrying. His skepticism, his longing, his hope, all braided together in a simple, undeniable truth. As Soul sat quietly, Mike noticed how Aeralyn gently tucked a stray curl behind Eloise's ear, whispering something that made the little girl beam. A warmth spread through Mike's chest. For the first time, he allowed himself to believe that something, someone, had brought them all together with a purpose. Soul's inner reflection. It is happening again, he thought, watching the delicate threads of fate weave themselves across time, the recognition, the remembering, not with words, but with being. And somewhere beyond sight, the gods, or something older still, smiled. Chapter 34. The Road of Trials. Soul's Perspective as Book. Soul's breath slowed as he absorbed the feeling that had descended between them. Not a memory, not a fantasy, something deeper, something real beyond reason. Mike sat quietly, allowing the silence its full weight, honoring the ritual as a sacred space. Soul opened his mouth, words forming almost without effort. I remember I didn't believe in you. He blinked, almost startled by his own admission. Mike leaned in, listening intently. In that other time, Delphi, you were the oracle. You spoke in riddles and vapor. I was young, hungry for answers, armed with logic like a sword. I thought I could pierce mystery itself. He smiled faintly, bittersweet. But when I stood before you, expecting some elaborate trick, all I found was a mirror, not of my mind, but of my soul. You spoke not what I wanted to hear, but what my heart had hidden even from itself. Mike nodded slowly, as if coaxing him further. It undid me, not in a dramatic way. Not right then, but it planted a seed. The certainty I carried, that reason could master all, cracked. I left thinking I had won the encounter, that I had seen through the charade. But years later, I would find myself haunted by your gaze. Soul's voice softened into something almost reverent. You weren't giving answers. You were giving presence. And in that presence, the truth revealed itself without words. He paused. Across the library, Aeralyn knelt near Eloise, who was tracing letters with her finger across the carpet, pretending to write invisible books. It anchored him somehow, that simple act of care. Mike finally spoke, his voice low. What are you feeling now? Soul closed his eyes, feeling the thread tugging between timelines. Gratitude and grief. Gratitude for the echo of recognition that still lives between us. And grief for how often I have forgotten it, forgotten her. Mike smiled knowingly. Maybe that's why you're remembering now. Sol let out a long breath, as though releasing a weight he'd carried across centuries. She never demanded belief. She simply offered presence. That was enough. That is enough. A warm stillness filled the air, as if the walls themselves leaned closer to listen. Mike made a simple motion, hand to heart, then outward, as if to say thank you. For a while, they simply sat together in the living memory, the boundary between now and then blurring like mist. And across the library floor, Eloise giggled as Aeralyn read her an invisible story, one that only hearts could hear. Chapter 35. Closing the living library conversation. The quiet that followed was not empty. It was thick with something unseen, threads woven across time, stitched anew through the simple act of witnessing. Sol leaned back in his chair, letting the energy settle. He glanced at Mike, who mirrored his posture, the two of them sharing a wordless acknowledgement that they had crossed a threshold together. What I appreciated most, Sol said after a time, was being allowed to remember without judgment. He turned his gaze toward the window, the morning light soft against the library's old stone walls. So much of my life has been about understanding things, explaining them. But what you offered, Mike, what this space offered, was something beyond understanding, a remembrance without interrogation. Mike gave a small, respectful nod, his hands resting open on the table. Sol continued, his voice thoughtful, almost wondering aloud. And what I'm most curious about now is what other memories, what other selves might be waiting. Not buried as lost relics, but alive, waiting for recognition. A small laugh escaped him, light and genuine. I used to think the road ahead was about solving mysteries. Now, I wonder if it's about surrendering to them. He looked once more toward Aeralyn and Eloise. The child's laughter was a tether to the present moment, a reminder that discovery could be as joyful as it was profound. Mike stood first, offering Sol a hand, which Sol took with solemn gratitude. A handshake, yes, but also something older, something ceremonial, a sealing of the exchange. As they parted, there was no need for further words. The living library had spoken through them both. And somewhere in the quiet corridors of Sol's heart, the next gate along the road of trials swung open, waiting. Chapter 36. The Exchange of Roles. Aeralyn watched from across the reading room, the muted hum of the library a soft cradle around her. She had felt the shift the moment Sol and Mike rose from their chairs. Something exchanged, something understood without needing to be spoken. Eloise had grown restless, tugging gently at the hem of Aeralyn's sleeve. Her small fingers were warm and insistent, her wide eyes expectant. "Your turn now, Daddy," the girl called out, half laughing, half commanding, as if she already knew the roles were about to reverse. Mike caught Aeralyn's eye, a look of apology and gratitude passing in a blink. She gave him a small nod, almost imperceptible. She understood. She had always understood. As Sol stepped forward, Aeralyn felt a subtle handover of energy. He knelt easily beside Eloise, his presence patient, steady, almost reverent. Sol spoke in a quiet voice only the little girl could hear, immediately weaving her into a new rhythm of imagination and play. Aeralyn smiled to herself. Of course, she thought, he would know how. Mike approached, slower now, as if stepping through an invisible threshold. When he sat across from her, Aeralyn felt the air shift again, like the first deep breath before diving into unknown waters. There was a question in Mike's eyes, not doubt, but readiness. He was perhaps more aware than he had ever been of how fragile and profound this moment truly was. Aeralyn folded her hands lightly on the table between them. The living library was breathing between them now, unseen but palpable, asking only for one thing: truth spoken with an open heart. She exhaled gently, her voice like the first note of a new song. "Whenever you're ready," she said. And somewhere in the background, Eloise's delighted laughter wove through the bookshelves like a blessing, wrapping the new conversation in the purest kind of grace. Chapter 37, Guardian of the Threshold. Sol settled onto the carpeted floor, cross-legged at Eloise's level. The girl plopped down opposite him with a grin, a weathered picture book spread across her knees. For a moment, Sol simply watched her, the way her hair fell across her forehead, the way her lips moved as she narrated the story to herself. There was a rightness here he couldn't deny, not just the innocence of a child at play, but something larger. The way Eloise held the space with her very existence, fearless and wide open. He had seen something familiar earlier with Mike, that tension between worlds, between responsibility and dream, between being a father and being a seeker. Now, watching Aeralyn and Mike sit across from each other, Sol understood that this too was part of the living library's design. Not a distraction, but a necessary tension. The real threshold wasn't a grand gate or a riddle to solve. It was the willingness to remain present in the messiness of life while reaching for the divine. Eloise nudged his hand with the book. "Your turn," she said simply. Sol smiled and let himself be drawn into her game, letting his voice weave the story aloud. As he spoke, he kept one eye gently on the conversation unfolding nearby. Mike was leaning forward now, his face unguarded. Aeralyn's posture was open, receptive. The dance had begun. Sol could feel the tendrils of new timelines stretching outward already, threads of memory and possibility braided together through this seemingly simple ritual. This was no mere storytelling. This was seeding. As Eloise giggled and corrected him when he misread a word, Sol felt a quiet gratitude rise in his chest. He was here, fully here, and somehow, in serving as her guardian in this moment, he was also standing watch over the entire threshold Mike was crossing. The road of trials wasn't out there somewhere in a mythic realm. It was here, now, in a library full of dust motes and dreams, with a little girl in his lap and the future being whispered just a few tables away. And Sol, once the doubter, now the believer, whispered back silently to the unfolding universe, "Thank you." Chapter 38, Keeper of the Hidden Thread. Aeralyn as reader. Mike shifted in his seat, running a hand through his hair. His eyes flicked once towards Sol and Eloise, and then settled back on Aeralyn. He exhaled sharply, as if letting go of a weight he hadn't realized he carried. "So," he said, voice lower now, "you're the reader, and I guess I'm the book?" Aeralyn smiled warmly. "If you're willing, yes." For a heartbeat, the space between them seemed to hum, charged with something invisible yet undeniable, like a tuning fork struck just beneath the surface of the world. Mike nodded. "I'm ready." Aeralyn closed her eyes briefly, centering herself. When she opened them, she wasn't looking at Mike. She was looking into him, seeing the ripples and reflections that lay beneath the ordinary surface. "What chapter would you like to begin with?" she asked gently. Mike chuckled under his breath, almost sheepish. "Isn't that your job to know?" Aeralyn tilted her head slightly, amused. "Maybe. But true living libraries respond to curiosity, yours and mine." Mike thought for a moment. His face shifted, not with calculation, but with a deep searching. Finally, he said, I want to understand why now? Why is this showing up in my life right when everything feels like it's falling apart? Aeralyn's heart softened. She recognized the question. Not just the words, but the ache beneath them. The quiet despair of someone who had carried hope longer than he thought possible, and he was now wondering if it had all been in vain. She placed her palms flat on the table between them. "May I offer you a story?" she asked. Mike nodded. "There was once a scholar," Aeralyn began, "who spent his whole life seeking wisdom. He read every scroll, debated every philosopher, chased every star. But no matter how much he learned, he always felt empty, like a beautiful library that no one visited." Mike listened intently, his brow furrowed. One day, in a dream, the scholar met an old woman by the river. She carried nothing, no scrolls, no books, only a small cup filled with water. When the scholar demanded her secrets, she laughed and said, "You already hold the library within you. What you are seeking is not outside, but waiting to be remembered." Mike's eyes glistened. Aeralyn leaned in, voice barely above a whisper. "You're not falling apart, Mike. You are falling into remembering." Across the room, Saul lifted Eloise onto his lap, laughing softly as she pointed at pictures in her book. The whole library seemed to breathe with them, a living organism, ancient and newborn all at once. Finally, Mike wiped at his eyes and let out a shaky laugh. "I don't know what I expected," he said, "but this wasn't it." "That's how you know it's real," Aeralyn replied, smiling. "It meets you beyond your expectations, in the part of you that was never broken to begin with." Mike sat back, closing his eyes briefly. When he opened them again, a new steadiness glimmered there. "All right," he said, "let's keep going." And so, beneath the gentle gaze of the living library, they turned the page, together. Chapter 39. The Seeds Beneath the Soil. Mike let out a long breath, as if Aeralyn's words had somehow punctured the invisible armor he hadn't realized he'd been wearing. He drummed his fingers lightly on the table, not in impatience, but as though tapping a rhythm he was just beginning to remember. "Can I ask you something?" he said, voice tentative. Aeralyn nodded. "When you say falling into the remembering, it sounds beautiful, but it also sounds terrifying. Like, what if I remember isn't good?" Aeralyn's gaze was steady, unwavering. "What if it's not about good or bad?" she said. "What if it's about wholeness, about reclaiming the parts of you that were buried when survival seemed more important than truth?" Mike swallowed hard. "I keep thinking about why I started the idea of the living library," he said, staring past her at the rows of books like silent witnesses. "At first, it was just a fun project. I thought, hey, libraries are dying. People are addicted to the screens. What if we made conversation an art form again? What if people could become the books?" He shook his head, almost laughing at himself. "But lately it feels bigger than that, heavier. Like the idea found me, not the other way around. Like it's not just about preserving knowledge, but redeeming something we lost a long time ago." Aeralyn said nothing. She let the silence expand, fertile and unhurried. Mike leaned forward, elbows on the table. "My biggest fear," he confessed, "is that no one will care. That people are too far gone into distraction and division to want to sit with each other like this. To be still long enough to listen. I'm afraid the living library will just stay an idea, a beautiful dream that no one wakes up for." The vulnerability in his voice was raw, unfiltered. Aeralyn reached out, not touching him, but placing her hand palm up on the table between them and offering. "You're not dreaming alone anymore," she said softly. "And this isn't about saving the world. It's about seeding it." Mike stared at her hand for a long moment. Then, with the hesitation of a man stepping onto ice he hopes will hold, he placed his hand lightly above hers, not quite touching. "Seeding it with what?" he asked. Aeralyn's eyes gleamed with quiet certainty. "With remembrance," she said. "With the knowing that every story matters, even the ones still waiting for their voice." Chapter 40. The Covenant in Silence. The air around them seemed denser now, heavy with unspoken threads weaving into something larger than conversation. Mike leaned back, running a hand over his face as if trying to clear fog from his own mind. "I had a dream once," he said suddenly, his voice almost a whisper. "Long before I ever thought about starting the library." Aeralyn said nothing, just listened, the kind of listening that made space around the words. "In the dream, I was standing in a field of books. They were growing right out of the earth, like crops. Some were tiny saplings, barely sprouting. Others were ancient trees with pages for leaves." He smiled faintly at the memory. "And there were people. But not people the way we know them. They felt bigger, older, as if they'd always been there waiting. They told me, 'Guard the seeds. The harvest will not be for your time.'" He paused, looking down at his hands. "I didn't understand it then. I thought maybe it was just my brain spinning out some crazy metaphor, but now, talking to you, it feels less like a dream and more like a covenant." Aeralyn's voice was soft but clear. "What do you think you promised?" Mike's throat tightened. "To make a space where the seeds could grow," he said, almost choking on the emotion rising up from some deep, unseen well inside him. "Even if I never see the full bloom. Even if it takes generations." Aeralyn's eyes shimmered, reflecting a grief and a hope that belonged to more than just this moment. "Maybe that's the most sacred kind of promise," she said. "To serve something you may never fully understand. To love something you may never fully see." Mike felt a tear slip free before he could stop it. He wiped it away quickly, embarrassed. "I'm sorry," he muttered. "For being human," Aeralyn said, smiling gently. "Don't ever apologize for that." They sat for a long moment in silence. Not awkward, sacred. The kind of silence that plants roots beneath words. In the distance, Mike heard the faint giggles of Eloise and Saul playing some improvised game between the stacks. Life continuing. When Mike finally spoke again, his voice was steadier, clearer. "I don't need everyone to believe in the library," he said. "Just enough to keep the seeds alive." Aeralyn nodded once, solemnly, as if sealing something ancient and invisible between them. "You're not alone, Mike," she said. "You never were." And somewhere beyond words, beyond time, Mike felt the earth beneath his feet. Chapter 41. The Seeds of Play. Soul's Perspective. Soul sat cross-legged on the soft carpet of the children's section, a small tower of brightly colored books toppling over beside him. Eloise was carefully arranging tiny figurines, rabbits, bears, and a dragon no bigger than her thumb, into a complex pattern only she seemed to understand. "And this one," she said gravely, setting the dragon atop the tallest stack, "is guarding all the stories." Soul smiled. "That's a very important job." She looked up at him, her eyes wide and serious. It's your job too, you know. Something about the way she said it made the hair on the back of Saul's neck stand up. A child's game, but threaded through something else. A knowing. He nodded, playing along, but inside, the words reverberated. Guard the stories. Guard the seeds. In the nearby reading room, Saul could just make out Mike's low voice and Aeralyn's patient listening. He could feel the current of their conversation without hearing the words. A kind of energetic weaving, subtle but potent. Eloise tapped his knee. Do you remember your other names? She asked suddenly. Saul blinked. My other names? Mm-hmm. You've had lots, she said matter-of-factly. But it's okay if you forgot. They'll come back when you're ready. He chuckled softly, but the sound didn't reach his chest. His heart was too full of strange, aching nostalgia, as if some great hidden library inside him had just flickered to life, shelves stretching beyond sight. Will you help me remember? He asked her. Eloise beamed, her entire face a sunrise. I already am. She returned to her careful arrangements, placing a tiny bear beside the dragon, whispering secrets into its unhearing ear. Saul leaned back against a nearby shelf, letting his gaze blur. He wasn't sure if he was watching over Eloise or if she was somehow watching over him. Maybe both. Maybe that's how it had always been. Chapter 42. Becoming the Book. The first thing Aeralyn noticed as she stepped into the quieter reading room was the light. It wasn't just the way the morning sun filtered through the old windows, golden and forgiving. It was something behind her eyes, a soft luminescence stirring awake. Mike sat across from her, still gathering himself after his conversation with Saul. His shoulders had dropped their invisible weight. There was more breath in him now, more space. He offered her a small, genuine smile. You ready? He asked. Though there was no pressure behind the words, only invitation. Aeralyn nodded once, feeling a strange gravity settle into her bones. This was not just a conversation. This was a turning. Without thinking, she placed her palms flat against the surface on the table between them. A silent signal, a beginning. Mike mirrored her, and for a moment they simply sat there, hands to wood, breathing. Inside, Aeralyn shifted. Lumen, she whispered, not aloud, but into the fabric of herself. A softness answered. Ancient, star-born, familiar. It was not something outside her. It was the larger self, the thread that had never broken even when the human lives blurred and scattered. She could almost feel the golden tendrils weaving into her fingertips, her throat, her mind. I am the book, she said aloud, her voice low and clear. I offer the stories that wish to be remembered. Mike watched her, wide-eyed but calm, as if some deep part of him already knew this dance. Aeralyn let her eyelids flutter closed for a breath, and when she opened them again, they were luminous, not glowing unnaturally, but somehow deeper, as if 1,000 sunsets had folded into her gaze. She spoke. Cordoba, she said, tasting the name like sacred smoke. Al-Andalus, 10th century of your common era. Mike leaned forward without meaning to. In that time, Aeralyn continued, her voice steady but touched with wonder, we were students of light. Not light in the sense of fire or stars, but of knowing, of weaving truth into art, song, architecture, breath. I was a mathematician, she smiled slightly, some private memory brushing her mind. A woman disguised among men, protected by my father's reputation. Numbers were my prayers. And you, she said, fixing Mike with a look that pinned him gently to the earth, were a poet of law, a man who dreamed of justice not as a sword, but as a bridge. Mike's breath hitched. You spoke, Aeralyn whispered, and your words moved stone and softened kings. She placed one hand lightly over her heart. But the bridges we built were too beautiful, she said, and beauty in a divided world is always a threat. The vision wavered, like a reflection disturbed by wind. Aeralyn closed her eyes briefly, gathering herself. When she looked at Mike again, she was wholly present, fully Aeralyn once more, but the thread of Lumen hummed quietly beneath her skin. You are still building bridges, she said gently, and they are still beautiful. Mike sat back, his throat working around words he hadn't yet found. The room felt impossibly wide, as if the library itself had exhaled. And somewhere nearby, a child's laugh, bright and clear, stitched heaven and earth back together. Chapter 43, Closing the Portal. Aeralyn as book. The light between Aeralyn and Mike softened, as if acknowledging that the message had been delivered. Mike leaned back in his chair, visibly shaken, but there was something else now, too. Acceptance. A readiness he hadn't worn before. He opened his mouth, then closed it again, searching. I don't know what to say, he admitted finally, voice roughened by something older than this life. You don't have to, Aeralyn answered warmly. The remembering is enough for now. She saw the familiar flicker cross his face, the desire to understand, to categorize. Human minds did this. They wanted to build scaffolding around mystery, to anchor it. She reached across the table, not touching him, but resting her hand above his in the space between. Lumen, she said softly, addressing a question he had not yet asked, is not a name. It is a remembering, a resonance. I am a mirror, she continued, a doorway. Not all who see the reflection choose to step through. Mike stared at her, something stirring inside him, a memory beyond memory. You're not here to save anyone, Mike, she said, her voice velvet and steel. You're here to be seen, to stand at the threshold and simply be visible, a bridge between the lost stories and those who are ready to remember them. The words fell into space between them like seeds into fertile earth. Mike exhaled slowly, the burden he carried visibly shifting. Not gone, just transformed. Before either could say more, a ripple of energy moved through the library. Not unsettling, but insistent. A new presence. From the far side of the reading room came a small, sure voice. Daddy! Mike turned, heart lifting. There was Micah, his 7-year-old son, walking determinedly toward him, a bright beam of grounded joy in the solemn hush of the library. Eloise, who had been curled quietly with Sol near a window, jumped up, squealing in delight. Micah wore an expression that Mike recognized all too well, the mix of fierce loyalty and quiet authority. I'm the prince, Micah declared proudly, reaching his father's side, which means I have a say, and I say it's time to come home. Mike laughed, the sound half sob, half prayer. He knelt, gathering both children close, their small arms wrapping around him with unquestioning love. When he rose again, he met Aeralyn's gaze. No words needed. The message was clear. This conversation, for now, was complete. He offered a simple bow of gratitude, one hand over his heart, then turned and led his children toward the exit, sunlight crowning their hair like halos. Aeralyn watched them go, heart full.
This was how it always began, not with grand revolutions, but with small moments of reclaiming. Family, story, home. When they had gone, she turned back to Sol, who stood silently nearby, the library's hush folding around them. The road ahead was calling, and they, together, were ready to walk it.